Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Cooper Gallery. My name is Sophia Yadong-Hao, and I'm the director of Cooper Gallery. So first of all, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's great to see so many of you, our old and new friends, gathered together to celebrate the opening of the third phase of the Ignorant Art School's Cooper Gallery's ongoing project entitled Ignorant Art School. But this third phase is actually entitled But Their New Songs by one of the most distinctive and critically inspiring artists collectives working within and out with the art world today. So sitting alongside me, we have Anjalika, Sagar, and Kodwo, Eshun of the Otolith Group, as well as Dr. Ranjana Thapalyal, an artist and a writer based in Glasgow, who will be in conversation this evening with Anjalika and Kodwo. So also present here, but off stage, are the Otolith Group's studio manager, Hannah Liley, and my colleagues at the Cooper Gallery, Peter Amor, Eileen Daly, Runa Jack, Jamie Donald, and Sarah Gillespie, who together have made everything possible. So I would also like to take this opportunity to thank the founder of this project, Creative Scotland, in particular Amanda Cattle, Head of Visual Arts at Creative Scotland, for your consistent support, encouragement, and faith in Cooper Gallery. Thank you, Amanda. I would also like to thank our colleagues at Dundee, especially our Dean, Professor Anita Taylor, and Associate Dean of Research, Professor Callum Kelvin, for their unconditional support. So before we properly begin, I wish to share a few words about the Ignorant Art School. So initiated in 2021, the Ignorant Art School 5 Sittings Towards Creative Emancipation is an ongoing sequence of 5 exhibition and event program that seeks to cultivate the ground for an emancipated future of many futures. Taking inspiration from feminist critic Gayatri Chakraborty-Spivak, who describes her work as a stream, ongoing learning of what to unlearn and how to unlearn. The core intention of the Ignorant Art School is to examine the histories and future possibilities of art education, the role of art education in society, and last but not the least, to celebrate the emancipatory and the transformative potential of art pedagogy and creative learning. So emphasizing knowledge as a social experience rooted in collaborative and collective endeavor, the abiding critical concern for the Ignorant Art School is to question assumptions of what knowledge is and how and where knowledge is formed, mediated, and shared. And most importantly, how knowledge is marked by the violence of power and the ongoing economization of knowledge production and the education we face today on multiple fronts. So to know more about the projects and to learn a little bit more about the previous 2 sittings, I would like to invite you to delve into our very kind of extensive online documentation of the Art School. But right now we're thrilled to unveil But Their New Songs by the Otolith Group. So the Otolith Group's profound body of work inhabits radical and diasporic futurisms. They utilizes modes of digital making, exhibition making, and discourse making to create what they call, I quote, thinking speculatively with a science fiction of the present, through the use of images, writing, sounds, performances, and discursive gathering. So the Otolith Group invent means of temporal and spatial transposition. They magnify thinking They multiply our understanding of what is study, what is knowledge, what is aesthetics, ecology, and what is decolonization. They compel us to constantly revise how we think, both politically and socially, the poetics that constitute our environments. And it is this, yet so much more, the Otolith Group bring into play, continually bring into question in these visually compelling and thought-provoking works which Cooper Gallery is humbled to momentarily hold. So I have been thinking about how to introduce the Otolith Group today. Their biography is on our website and in the handouts in your hands. But I wanted to try and draw out the very essence of their practice, which I have followed for 17 years, starting when I was still at art school in Manchester, saw their work at Corner House in 2006. So in my mind, the Otolith Group is a form of life, as they depicted in their manifesto, that is always on the move, activating, hijacking, hacking, intervening and disrupting, interrupting, suspending, re-instrumentalizing, refusing, resisting, and reimagining. But I will set aside my words and turn to art critic Ed Helter, who wrote in Art Forum, the leading international art journal, which published 2 comprehensive survey essays last year on Otolith Group's practice in their main issue, which is very unusual for any art journal. This, I think, is a demonstration of the significance of the Otolith Group's practice. So Helter wrote, and I quote, "The Otolith Group may be in the arts world, but they are not of it. Their greater strategy is the re-instrumentalization of this arts world as a base for a 21st century communications network. Sagar and Eshun hijack art world structures to serve not the needs of investment capital and individual egos, but rather the global circulation of radical ideas." So, and now, to contribute to this global circulation of radical ideas is our opening conversation, which is the first of the 10 events constituting our sitting curriculum, number 3, conceived in collaboration with the Department of Xenogenesis, or DXG, a pedagogical experiment, or a pedagogical time-space enacted by the Otolith Group. So today's opening event is entitled DXG number 1, Thinking the Otolith Sigil. Kodwo and Anjalika will be in conversation with Ranjana to illuminate the perspectives and the propositions of the collective through a close reading of the Otolith Group's sigil. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Ranjana, who is no stranger to the Ignorant Arts School. A generous ally of the Ignorant Arts School, Ranjana was one of the contributors to the sitting number 2 curriculum, and she was also commissioned to create the mesmerizing and poetic collaborative performance piece, Sound Seeds, which inaugurated the 12-hour sitting revel last year in the Botanic Garden of Dundee as the culminating event of sitting number 2. So Dr. Ranjana Thapalyal is an Indian-born interdisciplinary artist and writer. She lectured for many years at GSA and now works freelance. Her practice spans ceramics, painting, collaborative performance, and critical writing, and her research areas include materiality in art, cultural identity, and the metaphysical self in relation to all this. Of particular interest are concepts of self in South Asian and Western African traditions, feminist readings of ancient philosophies of the Global South, interdisciplinary and intercultural pedagogy. In her 2018 book, Education as a Mutual Translation, a Yoruba and ancient Indian interface for pedagogy in creative art, Ranjana suggests that a more resilient original voice emerges from awareness of others than from individualism, and that genuine pedagogical exchange changes students, tutor, and the work of both. So now, without further ado, I shall give the floor to Anjalika, Kodwo, and Ranjana. Thank you.
Thank you all. What a nice, full-looking room. You've all braved the Dundee wind to get here. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much, Kodwo and Anjalika, for being here, and Cooper Gallery for having us all. So we had a kind of pre-conversation conversation, and we found there were so many things we wanted to speak about, and so many interesting things that that Otolith have to say that we thought we'd have to be very disciplined to fit it into this to this 1 hour, and we came up with 5 areas that we could maybe pin it all down to. So we're going to try and time ourselves, stay to time, and try and pull out some of the key things that are important to the entire production and the poetry and the theory behind it all. So straight away, I mean, we're talking about the sigil. And then we had a discussion about is it sigil or sigil, but apparently it's either. So the sigil it is today. And it seemed to speak about the symbol itself seemed to be a really good starting point, because it's all about encryption, it's all about encoding, it's all about those many, many layers that lie beneath the surface. So maybe we could hear a little bit about how it all came about, where does it come from, what does it mean today?
Thank you, Ranjana, and thank you, Sophia, and thank you all for coming. And what an amazing welcome we've had here, honestly. One of the best.
And don't forget Drexy.
And this is Drexy. He's our dog, and his name comes from the history of Drexia. It's a mythology produced by 2 Detroit techno musicians and artists who were signed to a label called Underground Resistance. Kodwo wrote about them in the 90s, and you know, they were like basically the first analog techno group in the world, and the Germans can go to hell. And Drexia, basically it was this incredible mythology that they created about the sea and the Atlantic and the Black Atlantic. Anyway, you can find out more about that if you Google Drexia.
And so he might join in.
So he might join in, and he actually has a singing, we do singing together, but this isn't an improvisational space for singing, so we'll leave that. So the Otolith insignia, sigil, emblem, cultish like form, thought form, yantra, this thing that you see here, form of life perhaps that you see here, you see it on a trip, literally a trip around, as we post-90s of us understand the trip. Here it goes on a trip around the room, defining its different pulses and coordinates, beautifully put together by Runa, yeah, who's over there. I mean, absolutely some of the most beautiful sound panels we've ever experienced in our work installing. Thank you for that. You know, so why did we want to put ourselves next to this image? We can talk a little bit about its origins, but basically I want to say that it's an object of thinking, a thought form, through which multiple forms of thinking have been able to express themselves over time. It is an abstract form of thinking that allows for things to grow inside it, that doesn't get captured by techno-fascism, that doesn't get co-opted. This aesthetic challenge for us, I think, is important. But this is something I've not, we didn't define it at the beginning. It's more that it has kind of come about through experience, that this thought form kind of keeps speaking back to us as something that is in the world. And we can talk about all the different variations of its becoming, of its meaning. But it came about when we started because the Otolith Group, the term otolith means the crystals deep within your inner ear that guide your sense of orientation and balance. And in relation to Afrofuturism or Indo-futurism or let's say outer space, our first project was in zero gravity with the Russian Space Agency, a project organised by the Arts Catalyst in London to put artists into space. We made a work called Otolith 1, which was a meditation on my maternal grandmother, who was a feminist and a member of the National Federation of Indian Women and the larger communist movement of the Women's International Democratic Federation, her friendship with Valentina Tereshkova. And this film is a meditation on multiple things, but when the coincidental thing that happens in life sometimes happens, like Arts Catalyst wants to take us to zero gravity, or offered this opportunity that we applied for, I thought, well, let's make a work. We decided let's do this work, because the idea of Asia, communism, space, and all these things combined in that potential for us. We realized that in the process of researching what it would be like to perform 26 parabolic flights, we realized that our otoliths would be disrupted by if we looked around too much. So we decided that by looking at a horizon in the aeroplane as it moves up and down, we wouldn't be sick. So this led me to think about otoliths, and for me it became a kind of abstract geo-formation that would allow us to think through time vertically. This came about as an idea, this thought form. Kodwo, I think maybe
yeah, I think everything you say points to the idea that this image stands as both, it's an invitation. You know, there's a certain dimension of curiosity about it. What is it? What does it mean? What does it entail? What does it allude to? How is it readable or legible? How do you pronounce it? You know, and all of these relations to a viewer or a reader or a spectator or an audience, these are all invitations. So I'd say, first of all, we see it as an invitation. Another meaning for us entailed by invitation is portal. So we see it as some kind of entrance or threshold, some kind of ingress, a threshold that you cross. And related to invitation is initiation. The kind of unspoken promise that you will be initiated into a set of mysteries that are in some way collapsed inside of that seemingly minimal surface. What could be more straightforward? A zero with 3 lines.
Or a circle.
Or a circle. Or a sun. You know, but this notion of invitation, initiation, association, these are very important to us because it means you're in our world already. Just by looking at it, you're already kind of in the orbit of the associations that excite us. And maybe the last way of thinking about it, because as you can see, there's a certain endlessness and a certain proliferation that this sigil attracts to itself, kind of magnetizes meanings. It acts as a kind of protection, in a way. It kind of protects us because it goes forth while we do our thing, and it just journeys, it moves around, it circulates. There it is here, you can see it on the staircase as you come in. It's always at the end of our videos. It sits there at the threshold between the video and the rest of the world. So we think of it as it kind of protects the work we do. Because, when you're making a work, there's a point where you have nothing. And you have to keep going through that void. And you have to have a reason for the existence of what it is you're doing. And often we create what we call a climate of thought. And we try to sustain this climate of thought for the duration of the project. And you have to stay in it and you have to sustain it. Especially when you don't have a work as such. And this is part of that climate of thought. It sets up a tone and an effective structure, and it allows us to inhabit a certain way of thinking.
Kodwo, when you were speaking about this earlier, when you initially spoke about the symbol in this way, I was really struck by how much it is like a yantra, which is what you have in these diagrams of the universe that you have in Hindu cosmology. Now, that also made me think about all the other things that this represents, the circle and the three lines, because you've also mentioned elsewhere and in other conversations, it's reference to what was called the third world. And so there are two things that come out of this, which will probably bring our next few questions together in a way. But the political side of this could easily be forgotten because aesthetically it's very beautiful. But there's a kind of insistence in all your work that one unlayers all of those different things and finds out all the different aspects of life that are being contemplated. So, yes, it would be interesting to know a little bit about where that came from, why the three, why the circle, why, how is it about the third world?
Yeah, thank you.
So-called.
Thank you for that. I'll talk a bit about, we could call it the politics of citation, and then we can talk a bit about diagrams and yantras. We can continue talking about philosophy, which is also a question of politics. So it's a quotation, it's a citation. It comes from Jean-Luc Godard's film Le Gai Savoir from 1968, which is a film that means a lot to us. It's a film that I remember vividly watching as a child on Channel 4, and there's one moment where you think it's Godard standing and there's an image behind him, and then you realize it's a kind of like a mural. So Godard is in profile, he's reading a book, it's very difficult to see what the book is. And then next to him there is that sign with the word Z-E-R, zero. Zero underlined 3 times. That's where it comes from. And right away that work of invitation and initiation started working. And when we started working on the trilogy, something about the trilogy made us bring Otolith and this together. And it speaks to the politics of citation because when you do a bit more research, you find, on one hand, it speaks to Godard's interest in tricontinentalism, which was the movement launched in Cuba in mid-1960s by figures like Che Guevara. Tricontinentalism refers to the 3 continents of Latin America, Africa, and Asia. So it refers to a kind of revolutionary politics of the 60s. Tricontinentalism, 3 continents. At the same time, it also refers to what the French at the time called tiers-mondialisme, third worldism. So then it would be 0, world, and 3. So third worldism would be the politics, announced by Frantz Fanon in Wretched of the Earth, where he says, the third world is not a place, it's a project. It is a project that must be built. Vijay Prashad, in his great writing, Darker Nations, talks about the third world as a project. So it also refers to that notion. And there's even more meanings. The revolutionary Chairman Mao, the controversial revolutionary, had something that he called three worlds theory. That could also be seen in relation to this. So all these political associations circle around this. And in '68, after making Le Gai Savoir, Godard also made a series of cine tracts. Chris Marker made them, Agnès Varda made them. A lot of these French leftist filmmakers made them, and in one of the cine tracts, this pops up again. Then when Godard went to the UK, to London, to shoot 1+1, Sympathy for the Devils, this director, Richard Mordaunt, interviews Godard, and Godard is very mournful, and he says, "We were under zero." And you can see the interviewer going, "Sorry, what was that?" And Godard just goes, "We were under zero." And the interviewer is totally baffled. And Godard doesn't explain what he means by that phrase. But you could see a relation to this image again.
I think it's also can be seen as the world or the cosmos bearing down by the pull of the various different soil horizons in the earth. It could also be seen as the theorist Jean Mathie wrote as the lip of the void, from which everything comes. It can also be seen as the kind of, in relation to the sort of O as otolith and the three functions that the actual otolith geo-object in our ear, the sensitive structure by which bodies orient, balance and recognize acceleration and position, operate. So there's a kind of multiple dimensionality in recognizing that gravity is somewhat mysterious and orientation is somewhat created by this structure in the ear, this geo-object. And then one thinks about history or how we orient ourselves around time and move through time and accelerate through time on a linear level when the otoliths help us to walk in a straight line. So there are all these kinds of thoughts around that for me. And then there is, the hexagram of peace, I think it is, in I Ching, because my mum did I Ching all the time. And it also looks like a sort of an I Ching hexagram. For me, the circle is a limit. It's also a protection against, as it stands for O as otolith. It is a protection, as Kodwo mentioned earlier, against the kind of the racial, against total violence as being produced by the racial categories in many ways, in forms of extraction and everywhere we are now with climate and war, but the kind of racial categories as having produced this kind of very unnatural state of being where people feel they can question you about your racial background, both as a kind of accusation, a form of questioning, and somewhere perhaps curiosity.
So in a way, in a way, it's a kind of, as Ranjana says, it's a kind of a diagram, because in a way it condenses like all of these political formulations into this really elegant equation, in a way. And then maybe one final aspect is in a way, the politics of citation are both where an image comes from, and it's also the kind of the transformations that you subject your citation to. So there's a kind of element of mutation as this image migrates from the screen and from the world of 1960s Godard to different projects, and it changes color and it changes form. And so the migration and the mutation is as important as the origin and as its starting point for us.
Yes, that process is also, I think, embedded in the shapes within it, in that the circle is very much about cyclical time. And so we found ourselves thinking about African philosophy at one point and Indian philosophy, about there is an assumption that the time is, of course, is not linear, of course, it's not chronological. And it embeds all that. But I think it also made me think, again hearing you speaking about this, about something else that you've said elsewhere, about the way we listen and the way we experience sound or music. And there's an interview in which you were speaking about the What the Owl Knows, the film, which is here as well. And you were saying, don't listen to it indexically. Somebody's asking about the music that's in the background, which is a bit jarring at times and soothing at other times. It's very much part of the construction of the film. And you're saying, don't listen to it indexically, listen to the indexical sound. And I found that such a beautiful metaphor for so many things. Not just how we read symbols, how we read each other, but about the politics of pedagogy as well, where certain subjects are taken away from us because we're told they're not contemporary enough, or they're not sufficiently logical, or they're not, and it puts, actually, when you start breaking it down, most of the philosophies and religions of the global south into an area of untouchability. Because so I think it brings up all of those things as well. But it would be great to hear you both more on sound and the role it plays in the construction of your films and the readings that we take from them.
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think the role of sound, the role of music in kind of defining the modern condition of culture produced in the city is a long history. But let's say it is a way of thinking about languages that kind of involve a form of fugitivity, that stay inside a state of fugitivity from their appearance, from how things might appear. And so I think when we make our work, that we are constantly thinking about a third space in relation to how sound can occupy the image, and it can produce a state of thinking that doesn't relate necessarily to what you're seeing in the image, or maybe it does. I think the also sound as a sense, as a hearing, again we come back to the ear. I think in terms of the film Downstairs, O Horizon, and Tagore and the school that he created in Shantiniketan, one of the things that he was invested in, interested in, was opening the senses after having been deadened by occupation, British occupation, and by the cities as sites of kind of both great learning but also violence, and how nature had been relegated to a kind of space of extraction. And I think one of the things for him, for Tagore, was to take art students into Shantiniketan and trees, and to be around to open up the sonic world, to open up the senses. This has a lot to do with much of your work around Advaita Vedanta, I think, and around the senses and rasas and aesthetics, and the philosophical work you've done in relation to Yoruba thinking as well, which is fascinating. But I'm interested in the oral worlds. We are interested in vocality and sound in order, I think, to produce multi-directional ways into thinking about the image. Not that it starts with the image, it starts equally with sound.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. We talk a lot about looking in the key of listening. We talk a lot about a kind of sonic image, you know, so that there's a sense in which an image is an invitation to a certain kind of listening and a certain kind of attunement and a certain kind of attention. So the video that's here, What the Owl Knows, is really, it's an invitation for the viewer to pay attention to how the painter Lynette Yadom-Boakye pays attention to the painting that she is doing. So it's this kind of, it's video studying painting, which is inviting us to study video as it studies painting. So it's this, so we're really trying to focus on the quality of attention. And as soon as you do that, then the question of listening starts to, it takes on this importance. You know, it becomes crucial for us. And so what seems to be indexicaloid or incidental sound starts to take on multiple associations, starts to take on, you know, all kinds of associations which are numinous, which are not really available for articulation, but which are sensorial. And it's because, I guess, we want to get at certain sensations of time, certain structures of temporal experience, and we want to create a certain kind of auditory experience that brings people into a space of attentiveness. And so everything you say makes total sense. In a way, listening means everything to us because there's a certain degree of receptiveness that is entailed and implied by listening.
And there is also, you know, in forms of yogic practice of meditation, which are, for me, deeply kind of techno, let's say, counter kind of weapons in a way to techno-fascism, but not in terms of, yes, anyway. One of the things I learned very young was to turn the senses inward. For many different reasons that happens to me. And it was a kind of yogic lock of turning the senses inward. And one of the things is sound. So you can kind of almost go through, let's say, into the metaphysical world, into other worlds, through these locks, these, which are actually quite, they're very practical tools in locking the body to transport itself elsewhere, and into, or maybe into everything around us. So there is that as well, and that has, I think, for me, relates very much to also some of your work in relation to Advaita Vedanta philosophy and the senses and the rasas and this kind of way of reading aesthetics and experience.
I think it does, and also it touches on this notion of the self. What is the self? Is it the, as in Vedanta they say, is it the shape of names and forms, or the thing of name and forms, or is it something else? And the whole project is to question and question and question till you realize that this is a kind of reality, but it's not the reality.
Yeah.
Which is a very, very truncated explanation of Vedanta. But I think where it connects with what we've been speaking about earlier also is the self that goes through education, goes through life, social life, political life. And I suppose one of the things I've looked at is how does one address those several elements of the self when you're facing a classroom or when you're looking at a person who's teaching you. But I think beyond that, it's about how do we identify, who do we identify with, who are we allowed to identify with, and that is so complex today. So I wondered if we might think about the sigil in relation to, not literally what does it exemplify about Afrofuturism or Indofuturism, but what is it, does it cast some light on, or can we use it to think about what it means to imagine a future which is not of this present, but also has knowledge of this present, which is something that you've pointed out before, that we can't afford to just pretend nothing bad ever happened and we've suddenly got this perfect future. What does it mean to be politically, socially conscious and yet imagine these wonderful futures or troubled futures or whatever they are going to be?
Well, I mean, I think the present is completely captured. We're living in multiple states of enclosure. We are living also in an open-air prison. So, I mean, if the present is captured on every single level and everything is co-opted, we have to think about ways to get out of enclosure. You know, fugitivity is a trope within Afrofuturism that kind of thinks about space. In Indofuturism, it's something else. But I think the idea of liberation, emancipation, freedom, understanding how much is extracted from blackness in order to produce total violence, and how much is commodified from the racialized globally. Think about global blackness, from how much is extracted to produce war, to produce labor, to produce whatever it might be. You know, I think there is this sense of like of you know, thinking about the reality of the present in its kind of material inscription, meaning that all matter is a form of witness. If we're going to sort of open our awareness to reality, which is a very strange thing, our awareness has to now take on the post-human. And that is not just a beautiful concept of sort of, you know, an awareness that we are now kind of experiencing the oneness of everything. The matter is inscripted both with violence and with beauty, and all matter is a witness. So I think in terms of Afrofuturism's sort of beginnings, which was Kodwo's work from day one, but yeah, I'll leave it to you.
I think when you're embarking on a practice, when you undertake to make work, you know, you're choosing your ancestors, aesthetically speaking. And these ancestors are transhistorical. They exist across time and space. And you want to make work that brings the living and the dead with you. And you want to make work that speaks to those who are not yet living. So you want to find a way to make your work move through those dimensions and bring those dimensions with you. And I guess the question would be, why are we so obsessed with encryption and, in a way, assembling so much information into such a condensed and compressed space? Because we want to bring with us all that we feel we are, and we are part of the global majority, what Joan Key calls Afro-Asia.
Yeah.
That's where we are. That's what Gramsci calls the infinity of traces. Gramsci, the great Italian communist Marxist who the fascists imprisoned, said, as we know, history has deposited in us an infinity of traces without an inventory, and it is up to us to compile that inventory. And so it's really important to us that all the aspects and the associations that we've been talking about, those are the infinity of traces that constitute us. And so to find methods for bringing that with you in your undertakings every time you set out on a new project, that's part of the challenge. And so I think the question of futurism is to do with the structure of temporal experience. You know, that's a broader way of putting it, I think. It's to do with what we call chronopolitics. It's to do with the politics of time and how we orient ourselves in relation to those who are no longer living, those who are not yet living, and those who we live amongst. It's the structure of those types of temporal experience that we're trying to find a way to evoke.
I think we're also very interested in the kind of geological and the racial capitalist scene. We've made a work called Infinity Minus Infinity, where we brought together the racial capitalist scene and racism and climate change and racism, and thought about how to think about this very fact. And Catherine Youssef, who wrote A Billion Black Anthropocenes or None, and her book is in the reading space there. In her book, Black Rifts and White Geology, she takes us to the deep time of the 18th century paleontology, where blackness was placed in a time before the present and in a strata below it. And she discloses that Ralph Waldo Emerson saw the Negro, to use that term, as a fossil formation, an imaginary figure lodged in the deep time of being and the outer limits of Western ethics. In a form of genealogical wizardry, the Negro as fossil casts black time as back time, sedimented into another geological epoch and social strata. Life in the fossil archives is like waiting for promotion in geologic time. I'm quoting from Micheline Critchlow's unpublished book, so I'm not going to tell you what it is, because we were just given this introduction by Denise Ferreira de Silva to think about in a recent event we did in the States. But I think this is also not just about identity anymore. You know, this is about where so-called humans, black humans, racialized humans, have been compounded with matter in order to kind of extract from. So this identitarianism is a trap, because we're all subject to the racial capitalist scene.
Yes, I suppose we slightly differ on that, in that I think it can be a starting point, because I'm talking about working within the westernized education system, wherever you are. There are circumstances that mitigate against being able to grasp the material that will help you to transgress. And there was another, we don't really have time to go into it, but it's about, we were speaking about opacity and who do we explain to and who do we not, and this idea, which is very powerful, of turning your back on authority and not translating, not explaining, just getting on with it, is very powerful, and it works. But then there's that question of, are you then also alienating those people that do need to get that material? But that's really another topic, another time.
I think that the Black Audio Film Collective were always asked this question by people who were kind of looking for them to be able to explain themselves to whiteness and to a kind of man on the street, kind of, this is a... And they were always like, well, the people who come to see our work are the people we are making the work for.
No, I don't mean that. I don't mean that.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean to... I mean, for the African and Asian diaspora, for example, young students, young people who want to get the theory, but if it's not going to be very encodedly presented, it might be harder. But it's another way of learning.
I mean,
so I think,
again, as a young Asian person growing up in this country, thank God we were, and Kodwo was also subjected to the creation of Channel 4 when it first began. In fact, I had met Farouk Dundee the other day, who started Channel 4. And, you know, Channel 4 basically was an incredible platform to support all forms of social... it was an experiment in social becoming, actually, because it kind of supported... Not only did it support 128 radical workshop movements, from minors collectives, gay lesbian collectives, black Asian film collectives, all of them making films, but it also took the risk with the idea of community and said, we do not assume our community knows nothing. We assume the community knows a lot. And so let's put Buñuel on at 7 p.m. and see what people think. And so I watched, Black Audio Film Collective's work in the 80s and 90s, and it transformed my life because it was poetic and it was musical and it was actually thinking with the way that we watch television and the mind screen and our auditory way of thinking, the way of approaching the idea of complexity was something that was not, we weren't condescended to, we weren't just dismissed by these 90s reality TV monsters who destroyed the world, who've destroyed thinking. They created Endemol. Endemol created reality TV, and now you've got this media, and as Dennis Potter said, Murdoch is what I call my cancer. So I think for us, the sense that a community can be trusted to think is very important.
Yes, I
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just...
The only other thing I wanted to throw in, I think, on behalf of several conversations we had, which is that in that delving in part of that, I think some of the troubles that you're noticing actually come from not being sufficiently critical about those pasts as well. So, for example, I feel very conscious when I mention Hinduism and Vedanta and all these that at the moment it's being very politicized, and those aren't the aspects that I'm speaking of. So, I think with that. And with so many really interesting things that you've said and so many avenues you've opened out, we would love you to ask some questions if you have any.
Hi, how you doing? So I was sort of thinking about the insignia and the cultural history of certain groups and artists that have taken up insignias. So, for example, like Hollis Frampton that marked the insignia at the end of his films, HF, with a box round it, or the Germs, or Black Flag, these punk groups that very sort of coyly and knowingly created a sort of identity via the insignia. But in a way, like you talked about this sort of commodification or co-option, what happens is that sometimes those insignias then get kind of lost and divorced from the actual group identity or group politics of the artist. And I wondered what you thought about that way that things become so sort of diluted by culture, and whether how you could protect your insignia from being commodified and co-opted into a t-shirt or something like that an H&M t-shirt, and you see all these people with Nirvana t-shirts, and how many of them actually listen to the band, or know what it means now.
Yeah.
It's a really good question. I mean,
we haven't made any t-shirts or bags.
part of the thing, of course, is that in a way it is and it's not ours, because it's Godard made it. And maybe he was quoting somebody, we just don't know yet. So maybe he was citing somebody and we're citing that citation. So we're in a chain of citation. And that chain of citation is a kind of, it's a community, it's a trans-historical community across time. And, I mean, would it be the worst thing in the world if it became a t-shirt? When I was a teenager, I loved t-shirts. There were t-shirts of groups I wanted which I couldn't find. I would have killed for, I don't know, a magazine t-shirt or a New Order t-shirt or something. Is it so bad? Honestly, you've intuited the fact that clearly the energy of being a group, the group subject, and the form of life of a group where, it's the people, but there's something more about a group than the people.
I suppose what I'm talking is about subcultures and how subcultures get commodified by multinational corporations like H&M and then sell them back to to kids who don't know anything about these subcultures as a way of co-option and
Yeah, that's all true. But
financializing.
it's true, but I do believe in something.
That's a whole subject.
I do believe in something we call surplus knowledge, which is that there is a surplus which is escaping from commodifiability. There is something about a knowledge which can be subject to mutations and transformations that are not containable by the intentions or the wishes or the decisions of this or that corporation. So they may well intend commodification, but that's not the end of the story for an 18-year-old who buys that Otolith t-shirt, which is like kind of a hilarious idea. There's things that teenager will do things with that t-shirt, though we can't dream of. And honestly, that prospect fills me with a certain kind of joy. Actually, like a teenager somewhere across the planet buying that t-shirt and doing who knows what with it. That would be that moment of migration and mutation that in a way gave birth to what we were. And the fact that it's taking place through the vehicle of commodification only means that commodification can be turned to other meanings. Like, in other words, I do believe in the power of reception, interpretation, and transformation. Maybe that's naive, but I think the only way to test it would be to do a print run and find out. The only way would be to do a deal with Uniqlo and see what happens,
We're not going to do a deal with you.
I mean, I buy those Basquiat t-shirts. I have to admit, I buy every one of them. I'm waiting for the Ramel Z t-shirt. I'll buy every one of them. I can't help it. I buy the Keith Haring t-shirts. I can't not buy them because they're actually well priced, Okay.
Just listening to this brief discussion about groups and kind of music groups, I was just wondering if you ever would kind of adopt the position of, say, the Guerrilla Girls who have a changing membership, and whether the Otolith Group is a kind of a permeable space where others can join, so it kind of transcends the identity of you two as the founding members. Is that something you've ever thought about?
You want to talk about Richard?
Well,
as part of the group?
You can, since you thought of it.
Yeah, well, there was a third member of the Otolith Group who studied right here, Richard Cousins. He studied right here in DCJ, right here. So he came from that world, and he brought a lot of his. He's like this kind of comic, awkward structuralist, and he brought all that energy to our first works. And so we have had other participants, but we also do think of each time we make a work, we do assemble a group. Because we need the talents and the capacities of many people to make what we do. And we do all live inside this climate of thought that makes the work happen. So you can think of us as the lead singers, but it doesn't mean there isn't a drummer and a guitarist and a synthesist and a DP. There are a lot of other players.
I think also that you're pointing to collectivity and being a collective or an ongoing, growing collective. I was recently, there's suddenly been all this stuff, Turner-Prize collectives and this and that, and all these people talking about collectivity. Rather than talking about the work that collectives produced and the troubles that they had in the past. I mean, one could say that the entire history of communities of the commons comes from collectives, everywhere, all over the world. But in this day and age, I think to sustain a large collective financially is kind of impossible. And even groups like Black Audio fell apart because certain people were not pulling their weight, and this and that these kind of problems were happening. So I think for us the idea of a collective space is one that we practice when we are making a work, but then as an idea and as a thinking space to think with others is also something we practice. But then also just to keep thinking about the kind of threat upon collectives and also how to maintain a kind of rigor when it comes to thinking, rather than being naive and trying to create a collective of 20 people which won't last even 6 months. You know, financially, that is kind of difficult.
But I guess your DXG, you know, Department of Xenogenesis, in a way that's a kind of fluid community and collective in a way. But also you don't, you know, set up this kind of very rigid framework, and it's opening to everybody, as how you described for this collaboration between City and Curriculum number 3 and the Department for Xenogenesis. So I think that's, you know, that's quite interesting to think about how we could work together, but more importantly, you know, be together. And for this City number 3, Otolith Group invite everybody to think together critically. I think that's a, you know, very interesting but important, almost like a motto for this phase of the Ignorant Arts School. And you will see for every single title of the event, and we're talking about doing something critically. I think that brings in this idea of criticality. And then where radicality lies, I think it's always about, you know, generosity and criticality. That's something the Ignorant Arts School strives to do and to advocate.
Does anyone have any suggestions as to how this series of events could be used, to use Joan Key's phrase, to dismantle some of the structures that extract and actually turn this into something more of a critical dialogue throughout these months that are coming up? Any suggestions or any aspirations or hopes?
I think we will need to see how, you know, this whole process, you know, evolve. You know, this idea of a project. You know, early on, Kodwo talked about, you know, this third world. You know, this idea. It's actually a project. I think it would be quite interesting for people to know, if you've not had the chance to have a look at the handouts. You know, we have 10 events in total throughout these 2 months of exhibition period. So today we're thinking the Otolith Sigil together, and then we will have an event entitled Thinking Futuralisms Critically, and followed by Thinking Hydropoetics Critically, Thinking Butler Attentively, Thinking the Idea of Black Culture Critically, and Thinking the Improvisation Critically, which is a performance event. But alongside of these events, both online and in person, we will also have this night school cinema. Actually the first night school cinema will happen next Wednesday. So we will screen the Otolith Group's second film called Otolith 2, which was the first film I encountered in 2007. And then we, I think would you want to talk about this night school cinema?
Sure. The idea of cinema as a night school comes from the great filmmaker Ousmane Sembène, who formulates this notion of l'école du soir. And it really refers to the idea, you know, that when people are gathered together in front of a screen, there's a particular kind of intimacy, a particular kind of sociality, and a particular kind of pedagogy that takes form. What Serge Dany called a kind of secret communism that is shared between all those people. At the time, Semben was making his films. If you haven't seen Chedo, that is clearly one of the greatest films ever made, and you should just drop everything and go see it. At the time he was making that, he has a whole, he has a strong Marxist argument about the relation between the people, the screen, and the capacity to watch one's history played out in a future form, to recreate the past without fixing it to a pastness, to re-narrate the past. And that was pedagogically useful. So we wouldn't claim to be, to do things of that scale. What we do is quite modest. We do what we can with what we have. But that idea is an important one for us. And I think, it's an invitation to people to share a particular temporal experience and to collaboratively build a particular temporal structure of experience around that screen.
Thank you very much. So I think, also Goddard talks about the screen as a blackboard. I think it's quite interesting to think about where the community could be created and where this collaborating collective could be actualized. And then first of all, we need to be together. And it doesn't matter, if we have different ideas or we have disagreements. But the most important thing is that how we could actually, create or form this community. I think in the exhibition statements, we mentioned about this idea, interpretive community, and there are also books in the study area about affective communities. So that's all these interesting ideas floating around in this time space of the Otolith Group's exhibition at Cooper Gallery. And we would love to see you come back for future events and spend some time with the two film installations, but also with the study area, carefully, thoughtfully put together by the Otolith Group. And I would like to take the last opportunity to thank three speakers again for so generously sharing your insights with us and with Cooper Gallery's audience. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you, Sophia.
Thank you, Ranjana.
Thank you, Ranjana. Thank you, Sophia.